You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Hello and welcome to the Catholic Mama Podcast. I'm your host, Christine Mooney Flynn, and thanks for joining me and husband Pat. Hello, husband Pat.
It is always a joy to be on the Catholic Mama Podcast.
On this week's episode, where we are going to pick up where we left off on our part one of a series a few weeks ago, when we started setting the stage for sexual ethics. And we talked a lot about natural law, and now we're going to work our way into what marriage is, and what is the end of the natural, when we look at the natural law, what's the end of marriage, and we'll make our way towards natural family planning. Now, of course, thanks for anybody who was expecting us to quick turn around and do one in the past 2 weeks. We haven't been able to do it. This is our first time in front of the mics.
Yeah, I guess in part because we've been reaping the wonderful fruits of the natural end of marriage. And sometimes they frustrate the natural end of podcasting. To use some natural law language here. Meaning kids make it hard to podcast.
That's right. Kids make it hard to podcast. But then your sister got married.
Correct.
So all last weekend we were eyeball deep in wedding stuff. So it's interesting. It's just been marriage and family for the last few weeks nonstop, which is a beautiful thing. But it's also, like you said, it frustrates the natural end of podcasting.
Well, I think it was 2 weeks ago now. We got probably 18 or 19 minutes into this episode, and then little Marin woke up and decided
Squawk and squash. She was very chatty for a 7-month-old.
That was going to be the end of it, and it's a shame because I remember enjoying the conversation, but it's gone, lost into the ether, never to be
long
revisited.
Gone.
So, to be frank, I think we probably need to revisit some of the principles that we covered before and point back to that previous episode, because what we'll talk about with respect to marriage, and especially as we move on to more of the controversial issues in today's society, like birth control, are really only going to make sense if you have a clear understanding of those first principles of the natural moral law, what traditional natural law is. So we're just going to have to work off assumptions of that first episode.
So listen to that first episode.
Right, and understanding that the sort of proximate norm of morality is grounded in human nature. That there is a such thing as not just human nature, but natures in general. That things have an essence as designed by God, as created by God, that are oriented towards a certain end or a certain effect, or it might be a range of ends or effects, that is good and proper to the perfection of that thing, of that nature. So for human beings, our nature is, I think the traditional Aristotelian one is correct, that we are rational animals. And that what ultimately perfects us, our highest good, is knowing the ultimate good and loving and willing the ultimate good. And that is obviously God. There's no other higher or ultimate good than God. But there's many proximate goods. There's many other goods on the way to God, and that can be enjoyed and delighted in and celebrated, and even help promote us toward the ultimate end and ultimate good, which is God. And family life is one of those.
And real quick, if you want to go back and listen to that other episode, that was episode 118. I think this is going to be like 123 or something like that, or I don't know where. But 118. So you can go back and listen to that there. And one point, because you mentioned rational animal, that we are an animal species. We've got physical bodies and physical needs, but that rational part is really important. So, we brought it up in the last episode, but just to reiterate, that when we say natural, it doesn't mean, the natural law. I mean, it's not like the law of the jungle.
We're not just talking Mother Nature.
Yeah, not Mother Nature. So we are animals, but because we have that ration, and say what the bonobo chimps are, and which is why we can't look to the animal kingdom to say, well, they do it that way, so we're natural animal. We're animals too. We do it this way.
Yeah,
as well.
That's a total conflation in what. In traditional natural law ethics and morality, nature has a very specific, precise term, and it's really grounded on the philosophy of essentialism. There really are essences out there, or substantial forms, and next to essentialism, or coming out of essentialism, is teleology, meaning that depending on what something is, it will always be directed towards an effect or a certain range of effects. Protons are attracted to electrons. Acorns are aimed at becoming oak trees. Acorns never become lions or daffodils, for example, right? Given the nature of what an acorn is, it is always inherently directed at something. Now, it might not always achieve that. It might not always become an oak tree. Something might come and gobble it up or whatever. But it is reliably directed towards a certain end. Or effect. Now, humans are no different in principle. We're just different in terms of complexity, because we are far more complex than acorns, right? We are, as you mentioned it, we're rational animals. So we do fall under the genus of animal. Genus and species has a different meaning in philosophy than biology. So if you have any biologists listening, just understand that we're using these terms a little differently. And what marks us off, our specific difference as animals, is rationality. And that's something that, so far as we can tell, is a difference in degree of a difference in kind with human beings, not just degree. And our rationality, what flows from that, is what we see in our ability to use language, to reason from premises to conclusions by the canons of logic, to analyze the music of Mozart, to split the atom. All this comes to abstract concepts and mathematical reasoning. This is something that is utterly unique to human beings. Even the smartest of chimps can't even tell the difference syntactically between man bites dog and dog bites man. So when we say like animals are smart or intelligent, it's really not the same category of thing when we're talking about human intelligence, which is our ability to grasp abstract essences, concepts, universals, to engage in reasoning according to the canons of logic, mathematics, all these things, utterly unique to humans. And because we are a specific kind of animal, we don't base what is good for us or our morality off of other kinds of animals with different natures. We have to think about, well, what perfects a rational nature, a rational creature? Now, there might be other rational creatures out there, and in fact, as Catholics, we believe there are. Angels. But they're not rational animals.
Right.
They're incorporeal. They're really immaterial intellects. But humans aren't the only rational things, and who knows, there might be aliens out there, but so far as we know, on planet Earth, we're the only ones, and then immaterially there are angels as well.
So all this to say, you'll find when it comes especially, pretty much only in regards to the sexual act, it's the only time that humans are willing to compare themselves to the animal kingdom. Well, they, such and such species engages in homosexuality, which means we can too because we're animals.
Yeah.
Or dolphins have sex for pleasure. Well, that means we can too.
Right. And
you don't see this in anything else. Well, dolphins swim in the ocean and don't have to breathe air for long.
It's obviously stupid. And I'm not saying people are stupid. Sometimes they can be. But certain ideas are stupid. And you're right. This comes up a lot. It's a straw man. It's an equivocation. But we don't base human morality off of dolphin morality. In fact, dolphins aren't even more as a function of rationality. It's because we are rational agents that we can consider things under different conceptual descriptions. So I can consider you, Christine, as my wife, but also as the mother of my children, also as a podcaster. And I can do conjunctions. I can consider you as a wife and podcaster. It's like really infinite, the concepts I can consider you under and choose to focus on. And depending on what I decide to focus on, I can kind of orient myself in one direction or another when considering various goods. So I could actually choose to pursue things that are only apparently good or partially good versus what is really good and fully good. So that's where human free will comes in. Human free will is just a result of having intellect and being able to focus on or certain conceptual descriptions that are over and above the physical facts of something. That's not something a freaking dolphin can do. It just isn't. So they're not because they're not rational animals, they're not moral agents either. So morality doesn't even apply to them. And we all know the animals, they're not moral agents either. So morality doesn't even apply to them. And we all know this. This is why when like a hawk kills a fish, we don't say, "Oh, that hawk murdered that fish, send him to jail." Yeah. Or when a shark forcibly copulates with another shark, we don't say, "That shark's a rapist, try him," right? No, right? And imagine if we were to base our sexual behavior off of sharks. It'd be ridiculous, right? Everybody knows that this is insane and very silly. But yes, you do hear these common tropes come up as an objection to traditional natural law. And it just comes down to a confusion over how the term nature is being used.
Yeah, no, I know we talked about that in the last episode, but it's been a few weeks, and so
it's one
who knows, somebody new could be listening, and that's why I wanted to make
it's one of those things that's always worth refreshing on, because it's one of those things that comes up again. It's one of those sort of vampire objections. It doesn't matter how many times you refute it. Somebody online is always going to bring it up. So anyway. So once you have those kind of core philosophical commitments in place, what are called essentialism, that there really are essences and there really are ends that perfect certain things, and that is the good or the flourishing of that thing, then we're off and running. Then it's just a matter of deciding, okay, what is that for human beings? What is that for us? Now, we all want to be happy. That's sort of the categorical force of human beings. Every one of us wants to flourish, specifically. Even in extreme examples, we want to flourish. And by that I mean even somebody who's on the cusp of committing suicide is only considering it because they feel they would be better off dead. Mm-hmm. Now, we would argue that they're wrong about that. That's a wrong decision. But the only reason they're even considering it is because they still feel like this would be better for them. So we can't escape the fact that we will our own good, that we will our own flourishing. The only question is, are we choosing what actually will cause us to flourish or not? Are we choosing what really is good, or only what is apparently good or partially good?
And do we get at that through the natural law theory?
We can.
Okay.
We certainly can. With good hard thinking, you can derive the ultimate end of human flourishing, or at least a close approximation to it, without revelation. And this is what you see in the great pagan philosophers like Aristotle. And that's what's really cool is, Aristotle in his Nicomachean Ethics, which is a great place to start for anybody who's more interested in moral philosophy.
And it's available online for free.
Yeah, he is the one who really starts to develop that virtues are perfections of our powers. These are the sort of habits that really cause us to flourish, to be most fully excellent and alive, to be the most ideal example of what it means to be human. But even Aristotle still understood that our proper and true end has something to do with the divine. It has something to do with maybe it's contemplating the divine, maybe it's understanding the divine, but he understood that given our rational souls, given that we have a reasoning soul and we can understand something about our final end had something to do with the divine. He would have been surprised to find out that we could ever be friends with the divine or share in divine life. So reason couldn't get him that far, but that's where revelation comes in. So the way I like to put it is reason and philosophy converges on Christianity. Christianity completes reason and philosophy.
I like that.
It fills in the details. So philosophy can get you the big broad strokes. You can get really far with just good reasoning, but there might be some missing details that aren't incompatible with, but are kind of that extend beyond reason. So we say that faith is an extension of reason. It's not a diminishment of reason, properly understood. So a parallel example would be, through philosophy, we can argue for the existence of a broad monotheism, for a God that is pure actuality, perfect, omniscient, omnipotent, eternal, immutable, ontologically simple, perfect, omniscient, omnipotent, eternal, immutable, ontologically simple, so on.
Is that the God of the philosophers? Is that what we would call that?
Yeah, okay. And there's all kinds of philosophical arguments that can launch you into that. But Christianity adds content to that. It says, oh yeah, all that is true, plus, amazingly, God is also a trinity. 3 divine acts of understanding adhering in one perfect divine
But you
substance.
that requires revelation.
That's what St. Thomas would hold. He said, look, you can reason to a broad monotheism, but you really need God to reveal himself to you to understand the inner life of the Trinity. Mm-hmm. Now, they're compatible, but one has more detail or content that you can't reach through reason alone.
Sure.
And you see a parallel of that in the moral life. Reason can take you so far, it can give you a lot of the broad strokes, but it won't always give you the specific details. Now, what's great about revelation, and this is part of what somebody like Aquinas would say, is that we actually do require revelation because not everybody is an Aristotle, because not everybody is an Aristotle, not everybody is a moral philosopher, and God doesn't expect people to be. He doesn't expect people to either have the time or even just the intellectual capacity to sit down and figure this stuff out
from scratch.
Yeah, so right, or even if you have it, even if you have good tutors and stuff, it's still a major project to learn this stuff. It's a lifelong study. God doesn't ask the impossible of people, so He reveals it to us. And everything that God reveals, even in the Ten Commandments, again, totally compatible with what we can know through reason, but might give more specific content. Let me give another example. I promise we'll get the marriage here. We can know through reason that worship is owed to God in general, right? So worship would be under a category of justice. We can know through reason that justice is what perfects us. We should give to others what they are owed. And certainly what God is owed as a perfect being is our adoration, our worship, our veneration, all these things. So it can get you like the broad strokes of of understanding that there's something owed to God in the order of worship, adoration, veneration. But it can't tell you that you should keep Sundays holy.
Right.
Right? So that would be an example where God says, this is how I want you to worship me, and gives more specific content to what it's sort of an extension of what you can get from reason alone.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So revelation not only gives you the broad strokes, but the specific details, and you don't have to figure it out on your own. So that's good. So the point is that it's utterly reasonable to accept revelation. So I mean, one of the short answers of why marriage is what it is, and why we should accept the traditional definitions of marriage and not engage in birth control is because the church teaches it. And we believe that this is God's church, and He founded it, and He gave it to us as a moral guide. And we have good reasons to believe that. And in fact, it would be foolish to rebel against that, even if we haven't done all the philosophical work of seeing where the deeper logic can be derived from. So I just want to say that you'd be irrational to go against the church on these things. And that if you did all the philosophical work, you would see that. But maybe you don't see that right now, so you should just trust the church in the meantime.
Right. I think it comes back to, do you actually believe that this is the church that Jesus Christ founded, that He left in the hands of Peter, that it is an apostolic church that has been ongoing without interruption since the time of Jesus, that has been guided and led by the Holy Spirit since Pentecost, 2,000 some years, or around 2,000 years ago? Do you actually believe that? Because if so, then even if you don't understand, even if you haven't done all the homework, you really do if you trust that, then you got to trust the church's teachings. Right.
So we can push a little bit of a dilemma on Catholics, which I think is important. Is we have the dogma of indefectibility. The church cannot err. Cannot make an error in terms of faith, morals, or sacraments. And if the church were to teach something as moral when it isn't, or moral when it isn't moral, or immoral when it is moral, that would be a violation of the dogma of indefectibility, which would mean Catholicism isn't true.
Yeah.
Right? So either like you're with it or you're not. Now, I hold fully that the doctrine of indefectibility is not only true, but demonstrably true. One of the things that impressed me most before we came into the church was seeing how consistent the church was on the essential teachings of faith, morals, and sacraments. Now, you have to differentiate that from prudential teachings or disciplines, such as like tonsure, the way you cut your hair. That's not a moral teaching. But on the teachings of the Trinity, the Incarnation, the Eucharist, Mary, marriage, for example, the dignity of the human person, utterly consistent. And birth control is an interesting test with that, because Christians were even after the Reformation, most Christians were unanimously against birth control and contraception. It wasn't until the Anglican Church first caved around the 1920s that pretty much all the rest of Christianity went with it on the issue of birth control, except the Catholic Church. Now, there's two ways to look at that. One way is to say, oh, the Catholic Church is so stodgy and they're just so patriarchal or out of the times.
Or they want a bunch of Catholics to be born to take over the world.
Right, or they're just obsessed with how people use their genitals or what. I know I'm being somewhat uncharitable, but that's honestly kind of how I used to think about it before I was Catholic.
Me too.
Or you could say, if the doctrine of indefectibility is true, is this something that I would expect? Meaning, if the doctrine of indefectibility is true, might I expect that even as all of culture shifts, all of culture changes, even all the rest of Christianity changes, that I could expect the Catholic Church to remain firm? And I think, yes, that is what you could expect, and it's exactly what you see. So what might be initially repulsive to somebody who's just steeped in modern culture and you think there's no issue with birth control, actually for me, led to me wondering, well, why does the Church continue to teach this when like nobody else does, really?
Yeah.
And then you dive into the deeper philosophy and the history and you say, oh my goodness, I think the Catholic Church was right all along. So
right. So instead of it just being a point of contention, it was a catalyst.
Right. Yeah. It's initially repulsive, but I think actually if you understand what we're saying here, it should be a good reason not only to deepen your faith and trust that this really is God's church, but all the more reason to accept what the church teaches on these moral issues, even if you haven't worked out all the philosophical details yourself.
Right. And we also need to point out it's not like birth control is something new. I mean, I'm totally
well, some of the means
new. I mean, I'm totally
well, some of the means are new, like the chemical means.
But sure, yes. But I mean, birth control has been around for a very, very long time. Abortion's been around for a very, very, very long
infanticide.
time. Infanticide. Yeah, right. I mean, I'm blanking. What was the first like catechism type document?
The Didache.
The Didache outright condemns abortion, right?
Correct.
So, thank you. I knew it started with a D. I couldn't get farther than that. I know we as modern people tend to look down upon past generations, like, oh, we're so much more evolved now. Mm-hmm. We're so much more intelligent. Blah blah blah. We're so much more educated. But the fact is that while the birth control issue, the chemical means, came to the forefront in the 20th century, it's been around for a long time. The church has opposed it the whole time.
Correct.
So it's not just like, oh, it's something new that the church didn't change its teachings on to keep up with the changing times. It's that this was around all the time.
For your own, and it's fascinating.
It is fascinating, yeah.
Especially the sort of political forces, the nefarious political forces at play there now. Okay, so let's talk about, I was going to say sex, which I guess is true. Sounds weird on a Catholic podcast, but hey, you know what? God gave us it. It's a beautiful thing. It's, as long as the fire is kept in the fireplace and not learned to, run all around the house, it's a good thing. So yeah, we're not prudes, right? We like, sex is what God gave us, but like anything else, so we're rational animals, right? So we have an intellect, we have a reasoning soul, but we also have all these corporeal faculties and features. And procreation is one of them. So once you understand that there are essences and natures, there's an essence to human sexuality too. The primary end of which should require no robust argument, is right in front of you, right? Marriage. It's procreation. Obviously, sex is for procreation, for the propagation, survival of our species, right? Obviously, sex is for procreation, for the propagation, survival of our species, right? So the church has always affirmed the kind of the primary and secondary functions of the nature of sexual activity within human beings. Primary is towards the begetting of new human life. Secondary is the union to both satisfy our sexual urges, but also to find communion, companionship, fellowship, love, and ultimately marriage as well, which we're getting into. So the church has always said that the sort of nature of sex, which is part of marriage, and we'll get into why that is. Marriage kind of comes out of the nature of sex in some ways, especially what the primary nature of sex is, which is children, which take a great amount of care for a great number of years, that itself has binding force on the couples that bring the children to life. So the church has always affirmed both the unitive and procreative functions of the sexual act as the proper end of the sexual act. And to frustrate those acts is to frustrate your own flourishing, is to perform an immoral act. So once you understand the proper end of the sexual act, you can then understand what a good use of the sexual act is, and what we would call a perverted use of the sexual act would be. So we're not only going to get to marriage from this, but we will get to the sort of natural law grounds for why masturbation is immoral, for why homosexual behavior is immoral. And we always have to draw the distinctions that there's difference between inclinations or dispositions and behavior. It's the acts that are immoral, right?
Just because you want to do something does not, as long as you're not acting on it.
Right. Say that somebody, goes to hell because they're gay. That's ridiculous. That is a straw man. There are the actions. It's the actions that we care about. So we have, go ahead.
I do have a question about that now, because it was a reading this week about marriage and about Jesus saying, you've heard it said that if you commit adultery, or if you've lusted after a woman, you've committed adultery. But I say to you, if you've even looked at a woman with lust. Right. So how is that different between act and and
what Father Spitzer, who's awesome on EWTN, explained recently on this is that when you kind of exegete that passage, what you find is what Jesus is really saying is if you're making the intention. If you're making the intent, and we could see why that would obviously be
that's
immoral,
different.
even if you haven't committed it, just making the intention. Because what are you doing? You're turning yourself away from love and towards radical self-interest. And that's really what all these sexual sins involve when you really break it down. Like, it's not just that God just is weirdly obsessed with how you use your genitals. That's not it at all. God is trying to perfect you as a creature of self-giving love. And if we allow the sexual impulse to take us over in any number of inappropriate ways, what we're doing is we're starting to use people as instruments or ourselves as instruments, and we start becoming radically narcissistic. We start looking away from love, which is willing the good of the other, and only looking at our own radical self-interest. And that's the deeper perversion at play, right, of using people as instruments or means rather than treating them as ends in themselves. And in doing so, becoming even more narcissistic and radically self-interested, that we're starting to kind of bend ourselves over in this very radically self-interested narcissistic position, which over time may completely alienate. So that's the deeper, more insidious reason why these sexual acts could lead to really eternal separation from God. It's what it does to our soul in the long run, maybe in the short run as well.
Interesting.
Right?
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, so that's important. And it's not like everything is connected and everything matters when it comes to humans. So you can't consider it any one thing in isolation. Okay, let's just draw a few quick lines, and we could sketch more of the details in the next episode when we talk about birth control specifically. If sex is perfected, or at least needs to be open to, doesn't mean you have to have a baby every time you have sex. Obviously, nature doesn't intend that, right? We look at what nature intends. Nature has natural rhythms, cycles. So it's not immoral if you have sex and don't have a baby. Nobody's saying that. But you should be open to it. You should be open to it, unless there is some very strong overriding moral reason. And we can get into that when we talk birth control next reason. But we got to consider the normal means, not the exceptions first. Well, then we have to also consider the ends of the sexual act, which is not just bringing new life here onto earth, but also it involves the raising and the formation of that. We have binding moral obligations, once we have children, to make sure that we get those children to God. And a mom has special binding obligations, and a dad has special binding obligations. And it's not like children are fully developed in 6 months, and then you can go find a new husband and I can go find a new wife. No, most kids, let's be honest, take about 20 years until maybe they're somewhat independent. And chances are you're going to be having more kids within that 20-year span. So what does this commitment start to look like? Well, it starts to look like a lifelong commitment, that nature is intending monogamy. That nature is intending a lifelong monogamy, because we can't just consider the birthing of children, but also the obligations that we have to raise those children. Mom has a special duty of care to children. She can do things like you're doing right now, nursing a baby, that I can't. And the father has special obligations that I have to take care of to support the children while you're doing your obligations. So there's this deep harmony and compatibility that honestly, that any person who isn't just totally swept away in postmodern dogma easily recognizes, right? Sure. And once you understand that the sort of obligation is a continuous one, that once you bring new life in, it doesn't end there. that you are charged with the care of this new life, the development and the formation of this new life, you can then see why marriage has a binding force in terms of both monogamy and lifelong commitment. And it has almost everything to do with the obligations that you have to the children that you bring into the world. But not only to do with that, it also is good for you and I and any other. Not only to do with that, it also is good for you and I and any other couple to continue to move past just sexual passions and deepen our love for one another, the commitment for one another, the sacrifices we make for one another. So when I make sacrifices for the kid and I make sacrifices for you, I am growing in love and holiness, which is God's proper end for us, right? To share in the divine life. Same thing when you make sacrifices for me and for the kids and we stick together and work it out. Everybody benefits. The kids get proper formation. They get proper love. They get the proper attention from me and you. But we benefit by becoming more loving for our kids and each other.
And let's not forget, I mean, we are, a marriage is a sacrament, and the more that we engage in that sacrament of marriage, the greater the graces.
Right.
So we're not doing this on our own. It's not just Pat and Christine raising their children. It is God working through us, and we get a plenitude of graces for all of this. So,
moral philosophy. This is from the book Right and Reason by Austin Fagothy, and the subtitle is Ethics and Theory and Practice, based off the teachings of Aristotle and St. Thomas. And I'm going to just read the summary section on the part about marriage because I think it summarizes it well. Now, understand that there's a lot of paragraphs before this that substantiate these arguments, but I think the broad sketches should be of interest to people, and then you can grab the book if you want to get more of the details. But do you mind if I quote this at length?
No,
it's kind of long. All right. So the question is marriage merely a human convention or a natural institution? So he's going to argue that it's a natural institution. And he says that it is the only arrangement between the sexes permitted by the natural law is proved by 1, nature's design in establishing sex is the propagation of the race and is primarily directed to the child. So that's the first point. 2, the duty of caring for the child they beget falls on the parents, and this takes about he says 20 years, which is what I said. 3, the rearing of the child belongs to both parents jointly. The father owes not only support but active health. Yeah, so you can't be a deadbeat dad, right? That's deeply immoral. Therefore, nature demands a permanent and exclusive union guaranteed by contract. That is, the natural law demands marriage. So he's saying marriage is a natural kind. It's demanded by the natural law. I'll continue here. Father Austin says, while the primary end of marriage is the begetting and rearing of children, there are also secondary ends to satisfy man's craving for sexual pleasure, human love, companionship, and self-perpetuation. So pleasure's not bad. Let's be clear on that. Like, we get pleasure from food. What's bad is if we derive the pleasure but frustrate the primary purpose. So if we eat for pleasure and then throw up the food and frustrate the primary purpose of nutrition, then we're doing something not just physically bad, but morally bad.
Which you can easily then, between that and birth control.
Yeah, and he says about birth control right here. Birth control, in the sense of artificial contraception, is an unnatural use of sex within marriage, a frustration of a natural faculty, and therefore immoral. Eugenic, economic, social, political, and other reasons cannot justify it ethically. The, quote, rhythm method, since it is not unnatural, is allowable under certain conditions. So he's talking about natural family planning with the rhythm method. But here's what might surprise Catholics. It's only allowable under certain conditions, right? So if you need to have a morally overriding reason before you start to engage in the rhythm method. And one of the important distinctions to know, so, well, why use the rhythm method instead of birth control, right? And here's a good analogy I think can help people with. It's the difference between fasting and bulimia, right? It's not wrong to temporarily refrain from what is an otherwise good act, but it is wrong to intentionally frustrate or pervert what is otherwise a good act. So it's not wrong to frustrate or pervert what is otherwise a good act. So it's not wrong to temporarily fast if you know it would be healthy for whatever reason to not eat a meal every now and then. Mm-hmm. But it would be wrong to, whenever you eat, to throw it up. That's the difference, right? And that's a principal distinction.
In the next episode, we will go through those conditions of why the natural family, or we'll talk about natural family planning. Will we go into those conditions?
Correct, yeah. And part of it is that nature does give a natural rhythm, too, right? Nature doesn't intend that every time you have sex, you have a baby. In fact, that's impossible. But he's got two more things here. One is on polygamy. So he says, which is relevant, right? Because I think they just legalized polygamy in, was it Utah recently? But
I hadn't heard that.
So he says marriage has two main properties: unity and indissolubility. So these are the two main properties that are essential to marriage. Unity and indissolubility makes the primary end of marriage difficult as to the rearing of the children, and the secondary ends practically unattainable. So people can see that. Polyandry, one wife with several husbands, renders all the ends of marriage impossible. Both are against the natural law, but especially the latter. So he's saying polyandry is even worse than polygyny.
Yeah, traditionally that's very, very uncommon. I think there's only a culture in the Himalayan mountains that have that.
But both are out. Right?
I know,
Yeah.
But I mean, that's why.
But he's saying it's even more frustrating.
Which is probably why you don't actually. It's not very common.
Right. It's even more frustrating to the natural moral law. And then divorce, opposed to indissolubility, means not a mere separation, but an attempted dissolution of the marriage bond, so as to leave the partners free to remarry. The primary end of marriage requires the partners to remain together until the last child is reared. Since they are then over 60 years old, no justifying reason can be found for breaking the marriage. Accidentally divorce may not be harmful in individual cases, but it would be pernicious to mankind generally. Nature legislates for the common good and must keep nature's law. So that's another important thing which we haven't gotten into. The individual good matters as well, but so does the common good. And this is very strong in natural law and Catholic moral theology. There's kind of two extremes that we avoid, and both are liberal extremes. One liberal extreme is radical individualism. The other liberal extreme is radical collectivism. That would be like communism, socialism, Marxism. But radical individualism is really immoral too, where only the individual, but not the common good. Catholics, it's a both and. The individual matters, but so does the common good. And the common good is different than the collective, but that's a whole different conversation.
This is why we say things like exceptions shouldn't form rules.
Right, yeah. Whole different conversation.
This is why we say things like exceptions shouldn't form rules.
Right, yeah. You don't use exceptions to form the rules. So obviously divorce is another big topic at that, and not necessarily the one that we're trying to cover here. But once you understand kind of the general natural law basis, it gives you the grounds for all the church teaching on these things, right? It's not arbitrary. That's the point. Even if this is new to you and you still have a bunch of questions, just see that there are good principled reasons for why the church teaches everything that she teaches on marriage, the sexual act. None of it is arbitrary or outdated. It all comes from revelation. Yes, that's true, but revelation and the natural law come ultimately from the same source, which is God. So we wouldn't expect there to be a conflict, and there isn't.
Yeah, and I just real quick want to point out, because I did get messages after the last episode that we did together where people really seemed to it discovered it.
And it upholds it. So that's what's kind of actually cool to see that, oh no, actually, like, you see the foundations of this, the roots of it in the great pagan philosophers. And that just through good reasoning, you can reach these moral conclusions. And yeah, the church didn't invent the natural law. God did, right? When he created things with certain natures and perfections and ends and aims, and he created the world in a certain way with primary and secondary causes, and then gave us a reasoning soul that we can think about these things and discover these things. The church just upholds the natural law and clarifies it in specific instances, and can lay down certain disciplines in certain times or places to help facilitate our moral development. And disciplines could change, right? Times change, places change, circumstances change. So the church can impose or lift different disciplines, like fasting regulations, for example. But the church cannot, never has and never will be able to change the binding moral content itself.
That is good news, I think.
Yeah, it's great news. It'd be terrible, right? Like, what kind of world would we live in if God just changed his mind all the time? That would be a lack of perfection, right? That would be something less than a perfect being, a being that
God can't do that.
So it's not a lack. It's not because God is too weak that he can't change his mind. It's because God is so perfect. right? It's because he's omniscient. There's no like information that he could ever come into that would be like, oh, I didn't consider that, right? No, it's a matter of God's perfection that he's immutable, right?
I think that's pretty darn cool.
Yeah.
Okay. We covered a lot, which I hope this was all helpful for everybody. And I promise part 3, wait for it, next week, hopefully.
Yeah, well, honestly,
natural family planning, but you do need to, but I think we talked about this, before we hit record, that once we set the stage for all of this stuff, you get to natural family planning, and it all falls into line. Very easily.
A lot of the work has been done at this point. And look, we're just giving sketches here. We're doing the best we can on a podcast. There's so many good resources on this, and I always worry that we've given insufficient detail to really present the most robust account. But even if you have questions or objections, I would just start with this book right here, Right and Reason, by Father Austin Fagothy. You can grab it on Amazon, and not because you have to become a professional moral or philosopher or ethicist, but if nothing else, let it shore up your faith. Let it be known to you that the Catholic Church teaches nothing arbitrarily. And I think it will firm up your convictions, and it will help you in the moral life, and that's critical too. Mm-hmm. So yeah,
I will put the link to that in the show notes. I believe we did a podcast on what Catholics should read, and I think that was on the list as well. So I'll double check. Either way, I will put the link to that book, Right and Reason, in the show notes. If you don't want to miss the thrilling conclusion of our discussion on sexual ethics in the Catholic Church, please subscribe. And when you do subscribe, please leave, if you want to take a couple minutes, a very, very nice review. Wherever you listen, iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, wherever. Every review helps kind of boost the Catholic Mama in the search results. So somebody searches Catholicism, ta-da, it helps me get up there. Mm-hmm. And then I do this because I love the faith. I'm a convert. I used to be a degenerate sinner. Now I've been redeemed, excited about it, and want to share it with other people. So if you would like to help me do that, please consider leaving a nice review, or just letting your mom or friend or whoever you think might benefit know about the show as well. All right. I hope everyone has a wonderful day and happy solemnity. Wow, I have a hard time with that word, of Corpus Christi. Everyone, until next time.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you are never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.